somewhere in Papua New Guinea, in the heart of a pristine jungle, where people are rare, there's a giant cave known as the mother of all caves. It's a challenge for countless adventure enthusiasts. At this moment in time, 2 kilometers above the ground. 2 kilometers above the ground. A team of explorers is in full swing. Frank advised his teammate, Jude, to take a break, because he hasn't seen the sun for 17 days. He's exhausted, but Ryder insisted on going into the water, so they put on their wetsuits and started diving. It wasn't long before they came to a place called the Devil's Mouth, and they peeled back a few rocks, a gap just for their bodies, for a body to pass through. Frank took off his spare oxygen tank and slowly drilled his way through the hole. Next was Ryder, but because of his weight, he was stuck in the mouth of the house. Jude panicked. He scrambled and dragged his equipment with him. After a struggle, he managed to enter the entrance. He was shocked by what he saw in front of him. They found a huge underwater cavern. This could mean a whole new cave system. Before the surprise has worn off, disaster strikes. As they were about to turn back, Frank noticed a string of bubbles from Ryder's snorkel. There was a crack in his breathing tube. Before he could react, the tube burst. Ryder was about to die of asphyxiation. Frank immediately offered to switch oxygen masks with Jude. In the camp, George on the monitor yelled that Frank was crazy. But here's the bad news. Jude's survival instincts led him to grab his oxygen mask. After the exchange, Jude grabbed onto his oxygen mask and wouldn't let go. Frank quickly reached the limit of oxygen deprivation. A fierce but short-lived struggle, underwater under extreme pressure. Soon Ryder choked to death. When Frank returned with Jude's body, Josh, who never got along with his father, angrily blamed him that it was his father who killed Ryder. Knowing the dangers involved, George countered, sharing a full oxygen mask underwater with a full oxygen mask. He was a hero from the moment he took it off. He was a hero. With no contact with the surface, Frank sent his son Josh, and 3 other crew members, and 3 other members of the team to get a message to the ground. The rest of the base packed up and prepared to evacuate. They don't know it yet. Outside, there was thunder and lightning. The rain is pouring down. Fake Sue, who is still angry, tried to throw away the necklace on his chest. It's a birthday present made from the remains of wild animals. He made it from the remains of a wild animal for his birthday. Once twisted, it turns into a small flashlight. Suddenly they heard a clap of thunder. They quickly made their way to a communications site. Here they were able to contact the ground base, but the ground crew told them, the storm has turned into a tropical cyclone. They must evacuate immediately, but the equipment here can only communicate from above. They can't get through to the bottom. It's too late for the floodwaters. The 2 mates fight their way through the current. They climb the rope to the cave above. At the last moment, Josh gave up. He decided to risk his life by going back underground. To rescue the people deeper in the cave. At the same time, in the underground camp, there was a steady stream of water coming down the rock face. Frank realized something was wrong. Soon a cascade of water is pouring out of the cave. Soon the water is cascading out of the mouth of the cave, and at any moment, the whole camp could be flooded. Frank climbs up the wall to the entrance. Jasher and one of his teammates return. They tied a rope to a boulder. Xiao Mei is the first to climb over the waterfall, but the boulder begins to loosen under the force of the flood. The team tries to block the boulder with their bodies. It's all in vain under the violent impact of the water. Joshua and Xiao Mei are swept away, and the team member in the front was hit by the boulder. They were hit by the boulder and fell into the water. The only way out was blocked by the boulder. The moon was hit by a boulder and fell off the rock face into the water. When he was swept back by the current, he was badly injured. He was a bloody mess. All the bones in his body were broken. He couldn't even hold his respirator. There was no medication, and the water was still coming in. Frank said with tears in his eyes, "It's the end of the line." He couldn't talk anymore. He could only blink. It was the same thing that had happened to him. Frank finally pressed his dying team member into the water, and with a great deal of sadness, Frank knew what he had to do next. He had to get out of here before the water filled the place up, and get the rest of the men out of there. He told the men to pick up what they could. They had to find a new way out. But as a rock climber, Mei couldn't scuba dive. Frank suggested that Mei wear Jude's wetsuit. Otherwise, Being underwater for a long time would cause a wet temperature, but the stubborn May refused his offer. He thought it was more important to learn how to use a rebreather, and he'd rather freeze to death than wear a dead man's wetsuit. They had no choice but to take their diving gear and dive. They went deeper into the cave to find another way out. And then, as they passed through the mouth of the Devil's Manse, everyone made it through. Only the last one, May, got stuck at the mouth of the cave. She began to panic and struggle, but in the end, she made it through. But the coldness of the water made her start. She was shivering with a severe case of hypothermia. After all the efforts to save her, and the warmth of Carl's hugs, and Carl's warm embrace, she gradually regained her body temperature. But just as the crisis passed, George suddenly collapsed into the water, and when Frank came to question him, he lied and said he was fine. It turns out George had been suffering from decompression sickness. Just now, he noticed a large red spot on his chest. This meant that his condition was worsening, and then as he continued on his journey, he was vomiting blood. He knew he wouldn't survive. To avoid dragging his teammates down, he chose to commit suicide by hiding in the water. When Frank realized he'd fallen behind, he went back to look for him. All he found was George's reflection of himself carved into the stone, and the equipment he left behind, and the gear he left behind. Frank had to take his gear and move on, and then they followed the current, to a huge pothole. They had to cross it to get to the other side of the river, but they needed a rope to climb over it. The sun pretends to take the plunge, but it's a very difficult climb. Frank didn't want to do it, and that's when Mai said something surprising.
Let him do it, Frank! Your son is the best climber we have.
But Josh was quick. He was able to complete the task. Soon it was May's turn to climb the rope. Due to hypothermia, his fingers have not recovered from freezing. He could barely hold onto the protective rope on the rock face. Just then, Carl's torch hit Xiao Mei's eyes. He lost his footing and slipped. To make matters worse, his hair got caught in the descender. The screams were heard all over the bottom of the cliff. The woman's hair is caught in the descender. She's hanging in midair. The weight of her body was on the strand of hair. Her scalp was torn and bloodied. The screams echoed from the bottom of the cliff. The man in pain pulls out a knife and tries to cut the hair. Frank was yelling at him not to use the knife. Just hold on. We'll come for you. According to the authorities, Xiao Mei defied the urge to stop. She made the mistake of cutting the rope. She fell into a deep pool under the rock face. Her body disappeared, followed Xiao Mei into the water, and 3 sets of diving equipment. Now there are only 3 people left in the cave, and the only set of dive gear. Frank didn't despair. He decided to alternate the last snorkel between the 3 of them. But he didn't realize, there are things in this world that are worse than acute conditions. Humanity. Carl escaped alone with the last of his dive gear. He took off on his own. Frank immediately went after him but couldn't stop him. Frank was always the first to make a calm decision. He'd never given up, not even in the face of adversity. But at this moment, his determination slackened. It was as if his nerves had collapsed. Just when Frank was on the verge of giving up, Josh found a silver lining. Bat guano. It meant that there could be another way out of the cave. They followed the direction of the blessing. On the wet rock face without any ropes, they climb unprotected and unarmed. Finally, they find a new world. The sun shines in from outside the cave. It's the first time they've seen sunlight for days. Although the exit is close at hand, but without any climbing gear, there's no way for father and son to escape. They're faced with 2 choices: stop or keep going. Frank gave the choice to Josh. In the end, they chose to keep going. At that moment, Frank was surprised to find that his son had become him. As they walked, they came across Carl, who had run away. He's covered in blood and says he's hungry. He asked Josh for food, and in Carl's evasive gaze, Frank spotted the little boy. Frank found the body of Xiao Mei hidden away. The childishness of the body was gone, obviously eaten by him. When he discovered this, Frank refused to go with Carl, and took the last spare oxygen tank with him. Carl attacked Frank from behind. In the midst of a violent struggle, Frank's lung was punctured by a sharp rock on the ground. Josh rushed up and threw his oil lamp at Carl. Then he held him under the water. As Carl was about to suffocate, Josh let him go. He looked at his father groaning on the ground. He told Carl in anger, "He's the reason we're still alive. If you step forward, I'll kill you." Carl knew he couldn't beat Kawuk. so he jumped into the water alone to find a way out. It was the first time a son had ever acknowledged his father, but his father's life was at an end. He asked his son to help him on his last journey, just as he had done for the crew. In the darkness of the cave, Josh was crying and shaking. He pushed his father into the water with his own hands. After his father was gone, Josh dove into the water with a small canister of oxygen. He would only take a puff every so often. Josh walked through the fear of death, through the body of Carl, who was suffocating from lack of oxygen, and swam towards an unknown inlet. Without a light source, he unscrewed the beastly torch around his neck. A gift from his father. He had been so angry that he wanted to destroy it, but now it was the only light in the darkness. It took the last of his oxygen. Josh was lying on the rock face, breathing in these blisters to keep him alive. The lack of oxygen makes him dizzy. The exhaustion of the last few days and the high pressure underwater has left him extremely tired. The sunlight penetrates the water. Josh comes to his senses. With his last ounce of strength, he drilled his way out of the dark inferno. The sun is shining over the vast expanse of the sea. There's tension throughout the film, the suffocation of the light in the cave. It's like you're there, and you can't help but wonder. Human nature is the simplest and most instinctive, and yet it's the most complex thing of all. And those who dare to take risks, as the film says, they may have known what they were choosing.